Good afternoon, everyone. Even though we're online, I'd like to take a moment to thank you for virtually hosting us on your respective territories. Thank you especially for being here today for this webinar on the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, COSEWIC, and its Aboriginal Traditional Knowledge Subcommittee. My name is Marie Dallaire, and I am a Consultation Project Officer at the First Nation Quebec and Labrador Sustainable Development Institute. Today's webinar is part of a series of 3 webinars on species at risk. Note that a summary report of this meeting is available to those who request it. The presenters today are, for the COSEWIC presentation, John Reynolds, the COSEWIC Chair of the past 3 years and an Aquatic Conservation Professor at Simon Fraser University. For the COSEWIC Aboriginal Traditional Knowledge Subcommittee presentation, Gloria Goulet, one of the subcommittee co-chair, and Barb Ford, a subcommittee member. Great. So I'll let you begin.
All right. Well, thank you again for inviting me. I really do appreciate this, and it's wonderful to hear the different positions that everybody has who are on this call. So as I mentioned, I'm a professor. I study mostly aquatic conservation, aquatic species, but also some terrestrial ones. And I've, for the last 3.5 years, been the chair of COSEWIC. I've been involved with COSEWIC for a lot longer than that. I've had different roles on the committee. And so here's how we in COSEWIC fit into the federal species at risk process. We are an independent group of scientists from across the country who volunteer our time to assess the status of species. The members of COSEWIC are appointed by the Minister of Environment and Climate Change on the recommendation of COSEWIC itself. So we have our own independent processes, and that line between COSEWIC and the next box of protection decision is meant to be a firewall that represents the firewall of independence between us and the government. The government cannot tell us what to do, and we are recognized by the Species at Risk Act as being the body that advises the government on what the status is. We also don't really tell the government what to do. We simply say, tell them what status is, and that's all. So once we have assessed the status of a plant or animal, we tell the government what the status is with the status report, and then the government decides whether or not to protect the species under the federal legislation. So that is the listing decision, and we have Marie-Hélène here, who I think, if I understood her title, is involved in that. So that's a consultation the government does, and then if they decide they are going to protect the species under the federal legislation, that then begins the whole process of recovery planning and hopefully recovery action, things actually happening on the ground. Although I must admit, it doesn't always go that smoothly for threatened species in this country. So COSEWIC was established in 1977, and this was long before that we had federal legislation. There were always people who would meet to decide what the status of species was. It really became important what we did once the federal government created the Species at Risk Act, because then they decided that COSEWIC would be the body that would decide what the status was of species, and then go through the whole federal species at risk program. Okay, so we assess status and identify threats. We try to review the status every 10 years if we can keep up, and we inform the decisions then to the Minister of the Environment, and we usually have a press release and other ways of communicating the results of our work to the public. Next, click. It's more interesting to understand what we do not do. We do not have anything to do with the listing decisions that the federal government makes under SARA. We have nothing to do with recovery or management. We don't do any of that. That's the government. All we do is we tell the government what the status of species is. And this is an important thing to understand. It's frustrating to some people because I get letters about caribou or turtles and all kinds of things where people are desperate to try to save a population or a species. They're very worried about them. And I'm a conservation biologist. I have been for all my career. I would be writing those letters too. But we do not do that. We don't have direct impacts on what happens to species. I try to forward those to people who I think can help, but really all that we do is we assess the status of species. And so we have 46 members appointed by the Federal Minister of the Environment, that we have federal biologists, including from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. We have representatives of each province and territory on the committee. And we have the two members, as you heard, from Quebec with us, Jacques and Isabelle. We have three non-government members. These are just members who don't represent who are not from any particular organization. A recent thing we did last year is we added 2 early career science member positions. These are to help to diversify our committee and to give early career people a chance to see how we work. And of course, they bring skills to us that we definitely need. We have 10 co-chairs of species specialist subcommittees, and I will tell you about those people in a moment. And we also then have the co-chairs of the Aboriginal Traditional Knowledge Committee, and Gloria is one of those people who you'll be hearing from shortly. And so we are independent. We do not represent anybody. We don't. So there may be government scientists on COSEWIC, but they do not represent the government. They are there because they are experts about endangered species. And so we just look at the evidence of what the status is based on science and Aboriginal traditional knowledge, and we completely ignore anything to do with economic considerations or political considerations. So we never would say that it would be bad if we said that a certain fish was endangered, because then the government would have to close down maybe a lot of fisheries, and that would be very bad for the fishers. That is not relevant to the status of a species. So it's up to the government to make those difficult decisions. We do not consider that. We simply tell the government, best evidence that we have, here's the status of a species. The government then decides the really difficult questions of what they want to do about it, if anything. And they do not, as I mentioned, have to protect a species under the federal legislation. The Species at Risk Act is in many ways the legislation of last resort. Species should not even be coming to us. They are like patients coming into the emergency ward that are the result of the things that we are doing in the landscape, which means that other legislation and policies have failed. But the government could decide they want to do something for them in a way that does not invoke the prohibitions that are involved in the Species at Risk Act. And here are the 10 subcommittees that each of which is responsible for a different group of plants or animals. And so we have 2 co-chairs of each of these subcommittees, and there's usually about 12 more volunteers on each of the subcommittees. So the subcommittees are the ones who will decide what species they think we should look at, and we put out contracts so that independent people can write a status report for us, and then the subcommittee co-chairs help to get them reviewed by a wide variety of people before they finally bring them to the big group at meetings twice a year to decide on a vote on what the status of a species is. So if you add up the fact that there are 10 of these subcommittees and about 12 people on each of those, so right there, that's another 120 scientists who are involved in volunteering their time. They only get paid a very small honorarium and for our expenses of going to meetings. So if you add that number of people to the 46 that I mentioned, you get the idea that we have about 180 people across the country who are volunteering to their time to try on behalf of endangered species. So first we identify the priority species, and then we commission the status report, which is very important. So we put out a call for who wants to bid to write a status report. We typically pay anywhere between $8,000 for a status report. If it's a really complicated one, it could be quite a bit bigger contract than that. And then we have 3 rounds of review of our documents, and then finally we have 2 meetings a year to decide what the status is. We just finished last week our fall meeting. It has not been fun to go virtual with these meetings, as you can imagine. We get along very well with each other, and it's very difficult to have that many people on a Zoom call. But we're doing it. It's working, sort of. And we can't wait until we can get back to being in person. And when we do, observers are very welcome to come and listen in on the discussions. So we often have a lot of observers, especially if it's a high-profile species. We did polar bear a few years ago. In fact, it was the first meeting that I chaired, and that was in Ottawa. And we probably had 25 or 30 people came in as observers from a wide variety of interests. They included Indigenous representatives, people from the North, government, and non-government scientists, environmentalists, and so on. They don't speak at the meetings, but they are welcome to hear how we come up with the decisions that we do. So we use a quantitative criteria. So it is not as straightforward as you might think to decide whether something is endangered or threatened, which means it's in a little less trouble, or of special concern, or not endangered, and so on. To decide that, we have to use these quantitative criteria that have been developed by the international IUCN. They produce the famous red list of threatened species around the world. And the criteria we use could involve population decline. So how quickly is a species declining? That's an indication of a symptom of threat. Or how big is the distribution, and is there some combination with a small population size, and so on. So we take these criteria very seriously, and when we decide what the status is on a species, we have to also agree among ourselves on which criteria are leading us to that decision. So we don't, you can see here, we're not making things, we can't just make things up, and there's nothing in these criteria that have anything to do with social impacts or economic impacts. Again, that's the next step after we decide what the status is. This is these are the key criteria that we use. But of course, we do that in conjunction with traditional knowledge, which is brought to us by our Aboriginal Traditional Knowledge Committee, and Gloria and Barrie will tell you more about that. So it's not just these criteria, but we start with these criteria, and we also start with traditional knowledge, and we use both ways of knowing to try to decide what the status is. And I could just tell you that sometimes the Aboriginal traditional knowledge has been the key driver of our decision about what the status is. We would be in real trouble without it. So here's the last meeting we did before we went virtual. This was in Ottawa in 2019, I guess. Little did we know that we wouldn't see each other in person for a few years after that. Do you remember when we thought that the pandemic would just be a few months and then everything would be back to normal? So here we are. These are the members of the committee, and on the screen here, there's a screen in each corner that would say what the species is we're talking about, what the proposed status is, and what the criteria are, what the reasons are for thinking that's its status. So I've just got up and snapped a quick photo over here over the backs of a couple people's heads. But for example, if we were talking about a turtle, then these are the 2 members of the amphibian and reptile subcommittee. They're the 2 co-chairs, and one of them would be speaking and answering questions about their status report. It is very much like defending a PhD thesis for the co-chairs, because they get questions from all around the table. Everybody's read the report already. They have questions, and the discussions can go on for an hour or more if we can't make up our minds. Eventually, when things die down, I will call for a vote, and then people use clickers, so they have a remote way of voting, and they will vote and anonymously, and then the decision needs to be agreed by 2/3 majority. So it has to be 2/3. If they don't agree, then that might be a good time for a coffee break or something, and people will think about it, and we'll have a new suggestion. So if it doesn't pass as being threatened, somebody might say they think it's special concern, and then we go around again. So we can take quite a lot of time to get it right. And this just gives you a quick idea of the species that we assess. This is one reason why it's such a wonderful organization to work with. None of us is an expert on all of these species, but we do have experts there. And so here you can see a ringed seal. There's a plains hognose snake. I hope I'm not challenging the interpreters too much with some of these names. You can make them up, but you can see there's a bird. This is a prairie bird called a long spur, and so on. So it's very interesting to see these different species from all across Canada. And so who's in trouble in Canada? Well, vascular plants, of course. So that the reason for that is partly because we have a very large number of vascular plants. It's not that they are disproportionately threatened. Freshwater fishes, lots of trouble, and that is true. That is representative of difficulties of freshwater habitats around the world. There's a lot of difficulties here. Marine fishes, most of these are salmon that we have looked at, and we're going to soon be reassessing the status of Atlantic salmon. And that's going to be a very, very big job because there are many populations of salmon that each need to be assessed separately. And then here is where they are. A lot of them are in my province of British Columbia. A lot are in Ontario and Quebec. And these are species often in Quebec and Ontario that are at the edge of their range. Quebec is an endemic fish. Chevalier is the French name, copper red horse en anglais. And so these are where a lot of the other species are. These are in beautiful habitats, beautiful parts of adjacent Quebec and Ontario down in the south. I think I'll just, we'll go to the next one, please, just so that we can make sure we have lots of time. And I'll just mention sources of information again. I talked about two of them. We also use community science, which is amateurs who will post photographs of species to websites like iNaturalist or eBird, and we will use that information as well. And so we use whatever information we can get. The next and last slide. So this is an example for barn swallow. Used to be a very common bird. It still is in many places, but you can see these data on its rate of decline. So you can see an index of abundance and how it goes down. Welcome to my world. I spent a lot of my days looking at graphs that look like that. All of these data were collected by volunteers on breeding bird surveys. You can see in this case, the good news is that the decline has halted. And in fact, we decided that it was threatened, that it was, I think it meant it was threatened and not endangered. Or no, actually, I think it went to special concern from threatened. It went down one notch in the spring because fortunately things are better here. But this is an example of the kind of data we can get using community science. So Nathalie, I'll stop there and happy to turn things over back to you.
Great, thank you, John. Merci beaucoup. Maintenant, on va pouvoir passer directement à la prochaine.
We'll go directly to the next presentation.
Yeah, hi everyone. It's Barb Ford. I'm an Inuk from the region of northern Quebec, which we call Nunavik. And just a little background about myself. Born and raised in COSEWIC, and lived here all my life, and then spent a little bit of time in Montreal for my post-secondary studies. And I was lucky enough to come back to COSEWIC and work for Muckavik Corporation, which represents the Inuit and Nunavik. So the first few years I worked more in research, and then the last few years I've been working more in the policy side of things, so wildlife management. And it's my second term with the ATK subcommittee. And I'll let Gloria introduce herself a little more when she speaks. So we wanted to just bring your attention to two clauses in the SARA legislation that we felt was very important in guiding our work. And the first one is that really the decisions made should be based on the best available knowledge. So what you see here is scientific knowledge, community knowledge, and Aboriginal traditional knowledge, but not necessarily should be in that order. it should be that all knowledge is treated equally, and that there's an opportunity for all knowledge to be used in the assessment. And also, as John mentioned already, that there's a number of subcommittees established in the legislation, and that one of them was a subcommittee specializing in Aboriginal traditional knowledge. So it was already mentioned the importance of being independent, and that's holds true for our committee as well. We're really there to ensure that the best knowledge that's available is used, and portray what the situation is in reality for the species. So although we're there around the table, recommended by our national Aboriginal organizations, we're not there necessarily to push the agenda of where we come from, for example. We're really there to make sure that the best decision of the reality on the ground is made. And although some of these decisions that are made can be really important for us, listings of something like caribou, ring seal, or polar bear might have impacts on hunting rights, but we really have to make sure that Inuit knowledge, in my case at least, is incorporated into those decisions. So our committee is made up of 2 co-chairs and 10 members. We usually get 4-year terms, and they're staggered terms just to make sure that there's some continuity amongst the members. And many of the members are nominated by national Aboriginal organizations. So Inuit Tabarit Kanatami, in my case, the Métis National Council, Native Women's Association of Canada, Assembly of First Nations, Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, and we also have a few spots for ad hoc members. So there'll be a call for those members and people can apply. And we're all ministerial appointments. I think it's interesting that in the legislation, there's actually no definition of what Indigenous knowledge can be. So, it's open to interpretation, and this can be a good thing because there's so many different types of knowledge that can be used. But I think it also creates some confusion sometimes where people aren't so sure what's valid and what's not valid. So that's something to discuss in the future. But generally, it's relationships based between humans and their environment. It includes laws and protocols for human relationships passed on through teaching and stories, ceremony, and Indigenous language stories. Can be historical, can be contemporary. My favorite example of, in Inuit culture, it's very much an oral tradition, and knowledge is passed on from generation to generation. If you think about the Northwest Passage and the finding of Franklin's ships, Air and Erebus, this story was passed on from grandparents to grandchildren for many generations, and based on that knowledge, they were able to find the ships many years later. So it very much holds true. And in that example, we're talking about ships and people, but the same thing could be for beluga migration or bird migration or previous trends of population. So it's all very valid. Same thing with contemporary. Right now, today, it's a beautiful day in Kuujjuaq, and I have a friend that went out caribou hunting. So he's breaking trail looking for caribou, and when he comes back, he'll be able to tell us, did he find any caribou? What were the conditions on the trail? For example, ice thickness, or what kind of birds he found. And people are here every day living out on the land and going out. They're not strictly working 9 to 5 in the communities. They're very much, even to this day, very in tune with the environment. So that knowledge is important as well. Although knowledge can be, encompassing so much, cultural, for example, or perhaps traditional, like how to prepare a hide, which is passed on from generation to generation. Very important information, but may not be as useful in the actual assessment of the species. So during our discussions, we usually, as much as possible, try to focus on traditional knowledge that can be used in the assessment. So things like the distribution, the population size, and the things you see on the screen. And when we do our assessment report, table of contents, and the way it's laid out is actually very similar to the status report, and that makes it more easy for the report writer to incorporate the knowledge into the report. The committee is responsible for putting together different guidelines and processes that will make it for the knowledge to be used. So there's a number of different protocols that have been developed, and community approvals, making sure that the community is aware of how the knowledge is being used and they're willing for it to be used that way. Different ethical reviews, whether permits are required, to make sure that the community has informed consent, and different things like this. An important one is how to actually integrate the knowledge into the status report. And that can be a challenge because the knowledge is not always easily integrated because there are two ways of knowing. So those are some of the different things that the committee has been working on. And I think Gloria will take over from here.
Thank you, Barrie. I will just follow up and just give you a little bit of information on my background. I've been involved in the COSEWIC process in different ways over the last 20 years or more. I retired from government about 12 years ago. I'm a mother and grandmother, and so that's a new way to approach life. But the volunteer opportunity to participate on the ATK subcommittee is very important to me and to the people that I work with. On the subcommittee, we're all Indigenous. We have elders, we have resource users, we have people who haven't really grown up with their culture, but they are involved at this point because of how their lives have intersected with other things. Many of our people still speak their own languages, and it's a very diverse group. One of our first major challenges when the group was first organized was how do First Nations, Inuit, and Métis work together? It's not something they historically have figured out how to do appropriately based on colonization and the history of how we've been divided into compartments and kept separate in many ways. But we get together in the room and we realize we're there for the same reasons, and that is very important for our people and future generations and all Canadians, of course. So to continue on with the slide, I'm just going to turn off my camera because I have challenges with data. So what we do is very important. It was worked out over many years by the subcommittee. We have mostly produced Aboriginal knowledge reports that then become part of the COSEWIC status report, as Barrie mentioned, with the integration that's very important. So we have three types of reports we produce. The source reports are not meant to just identify where there are sources, but identify which Indigenous communities and organizations are associated within the range of a specific species. And often then we can determine from a lot, in this day and age, we can determine from online searches that where there may be information available, as well as AFSAR reports, the Aboriginal Fund for Species at Risk, which communities have conducted studies or research on species at risk. Our assessment reports are meant to summarize the available information, publicly available information, and especially helpful to identify where there's gaps in information. The gaps could be in science, in Western science, as well as in Indigenous knowledge. And then the most important work we do, which we haven't been able to carry through as much as we should or could if we had more resources and capacity, but that's to facilitate community-led ATK gathering reports. So our focus is on communities that have decided to work with us and have information. We provide the resources through ECCC to facilitate them gathering their own information in their own language and providing a summary that then is integrated with the COSEWIC status report. Our other duties are to provide guidance to COSEWIC contractors for how to integrate information from source and assessment reports. For the gathering reports, we use Indigenous people who have experience working with Indigenous knowledge and know how to integrate that type of information. We also contribute to species status reports there and the assessments, and we participate on all the COSEWIC subcommittees. We participate on at least one, sometimes more than one, depending on how many members we have. So as John mentioned, there are 10 species specialist subcommittees, and we look at all the species that they are going to assess or reassess. And since we can't do all of them, we have developed a way to identify which species we should follow up with. We call it a decision matrix, and it prioritizes the species that we feel are important for Indigenous people for reasons. And if you could go to the next slide, there's more detail on that. So the decision matrix is based on these criteria. How many communities and organizations are within the range of the species, the spatial distribution, the accessibility of ATK, the significance to Indigenous people for many reasons, and the benefit to the COSEWIC assessment. So you can imagine that a species like caribou, broadly distributed species, would score very high on this decision matrix. So species that score high are then put through an ATK source report, so we can actually identify all the communities and organizations that are within the range of that species. We then make a decision based on that, whether to go to an ATK assessment report. We use contractors for these reports. And just like with the COSEWIC status report, we have ways of paying our contractors through the secretariat, the COSEWIC secretariat. And from the assessment report, and based on the recommendations of the writer of the assessment report, as well as other information that we may have been able to access through other networks or other people, we will make a decision whether to go to a ATK gathering report. But all of these contribute to the COSEWIC status report to include Indigenous knowledge, which, as you've heard from the two previous speakers, is a really important part of the COSEWIC assessment. This is the only way for Indigenous people to get their information into the COSEWIC status report at the beginning of the SARA process. because following the COSEWIC assessment, there are, as you know, there are different post-assessment processes that are conducted by government, and they do what they call consultation with Indigenous people for species that are important to them on their traditional territories. But if the information is included in the original report, it provides more information for the government to make decisions on, and more likely that people will be appropriately asked for their participation in the post-assessment species at risk process. So it's really important to, can't make that point strong enough to say that we are always looking for ways to ensure that Indigenous people know that the species assessment process is the way for sharing their information when they want to. We're also well aware, because of our connections to many communities, that some people are not willing at this point in time to share their information. But we also want to know that and figure out how we might make that an easier process, or a more reasonable process for them. We have a recent example that we worked with people in BC on the including Indigenous knowledge in the steelhead trout report, the Thompson River steelhead trout, and integrated that information. And as John pointed out, it was well received, not only by COSEWIC, but by the people who provided that information in a summarized form, and we integrated it. And I can send the link to that. The report is now available in English and French on the SARA registry, so people can see how that was done in a respectful and appropriate way. And that's really something that's important to our group, to know that we're doing these things right. The things we don't do is send out emails asking for Indigenous knowledge from people. We always try to make a personal connection. We may send out an email to say, would you consider talking to us about whether you have ATK, and if you would like to share it, and let us know how we can facilitate that. So our approach is to first assess whether there's ATK, then determine if people would like to share it, and then collaborate with people on how they want to share it. And they always have the opportunity to review the integrated information before it becomes part of the COSEWIC process of assessment. So we're moving forward. We've always been uncomfortable with doing a species by species approach. However, we are part of COSEWIC, but we are, as a group now, discussing how to work on species, but through an ecosystem approach. And that includes everything within the environment and the other species, that the species of significance, say, if we look at caribou, everything within its world, and based on maybe an ecozone or a watershed approach, it'll depend on the people we work with. We're also starting to develop elder circles. We have many people on the East Coast now who have indicated interest in joining an elder circle that can advise us on what's going on with species and the habitats in their area. Also the threats that they're recognizing based on their long-term knowledge of what's going on in the area, and ways to ameliorate the situation for the habitat and the species. So we are moving on to that, and it'll be a bit of a process, but we wanted to make sure people know that we're not stuck on the species by species, and I don't think COSEWIC is either, based on many things that are going on within the COSEWIC group. So we're always looking for ways to improve how we do the work. We have issues with capacity. Getting nominations and getting appointments from those nominations is sometimes difficult. We want to increase community involvement for undocumented Indigenous knowledge. We've pretty much covered most of the species on the publicly available information, and it's never been something we thought was the way to fully integrate information, because that information may not have been approved by the community that gave it, or it would have changed over time. So it's never been something we felt was the only way to approach involving ATK in the species assessment process. I mentioned there's elder circles. We take every opportunity to provide public relations on the work we do. We, as I mentioned, an ecosystem approach and a threats analysis from an ATK perspective is also something. And we're also tracking species of Indigenous concerns that would likely never get on a COSEWIC priority list, just because they're so broadly distributed, and in some areas they're doing so well, but there are areas where they're not doing well at all. And we're continuing to track those, such as moose and white birch and black spruce. We've been hearing from people that there are issues in some parts of the country that they'd like us to make sure we're tracking this information, so we could go back at some point with COSEWIC and say, this species is having trouble in all these areas across the country that people have been telling us about, so that they can decide whether it could be prioritized for their list. The other issue is the equal weight of Western science and Aboriginal traditional knowledge. While this sounds like it should be easy to facilitate the way we're doing it, we totally recognize that there aren't enough Indigenous voices providing information through the very important, what we call the big table, the species assessment table, where at the last stage in the species assessment, there needs to be more Indigenous voices at that table, I believe. We're increasing equity, diversity, and including people, but that's going to be a long range way of working. We also want to build on ATK. We have a relatively small budget to be looking at all the work we do, all the species that we're supposed to be including ATK. And we know it's very frustrating for COSEWIC members when we tell them we can't provide ATK for a specific species. There are many reasons. For some, there's lots of information already available, especially when you think of bird species. There's many groups out there who are accessing information from different types of organizations, and that all comes together for their status report. So it's not a high priority, especially songbirds are not a high priority for most Indigenous communities. In the North, some species are more important because they're food related, but it's not always easy to get the information. People have maybe stopped hunting them or stopped collecting eggs, or and we, like I mentioned, limited resources. We don't always have the ability to check that. So we focus through our prioritization on species that we know are of concern to a lot of people, or in specific areas where we know that Indigenous people are really concerned about the threats and the decline in the population, especially if we look at the salmon species that are having a lot of trouble, a lot of declines on the West Coast. So there's other sources of ATK that are feeding naturally into the COSEWIC process. And some of those are the Department of Fisheries and Oceans hold pre-COSEWIC meetings where they produce a report. They call it a science report, but we know from our networks that they're always contacting Indigenous communities and organizations for their information, which often is included, but it's not respectfully acknowledged within the reports. We've talked to DFO about this, and they may consider doing things different. Also, there's many government and university funded projects ongoing at any time that are long-term, where biologists have made good relationships in communities and are collecting information, and they publish it in scientific journals, which of course then feed into the COSEWIC status report. The other thing, we have a few of our members are university professors, and they are making connections with other people in their universities to try to have some of the work done through the universities, and that would feed into the either the science report or into the ATK reports. So there are other ways, and of course our territorial and provincial partners are always involved in work in different ways with Indigenous communities in their jurisdictions, and those should also be flowing naturally into the COSEWIC process. So our process and protocol guidelines were developed through workshops held in the 2000s. We had 4 of them, one in the west, one in the east, one in the center, and one in the north, in Rankin Inlet in the north. And they included at least 300 or 400 elders, knowledge holders, and resource users at a total, who helped us to develop these process and protocol guidelines that are useful for our work, but also for people and communities that don't yet have their own set of process and protocol guidelines. It kind of covers the gamut of the importance. So I invite you to check that out and see how we do our work. Barrie mentioned it earlier in this slide, show that just the overview of what's required to that we feel and we're advised by at our workshops that were important and necessary for accessing and using ATK within the COSEWIC process. And our member biographies can be accessed there, so you can see the people you'd be working with if you contact us. Thank you, merci, and merci, which is Michif for merci. I'm finished. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Gloria and Barrie.
Thank you very much, Gloria and Barrie.